Hello everybody, my name is Leo, and if you follow our channel you know that we have done several videos about latency, and one specifically dedicated to the Quad Cortex, where we discovered some weaknesses in the latency management of the unit. For instance, we noticed that an effect block was adding latency even if switched off, and the delays and reverbs, especially when together, were increasing the overall latency. Well, if you check out the Neural DSP webpage where there are listed the improvements introduced with the firmware 2.1, you can notice this sentence. Overall, system audio latency has been improved. So, with this video we will check out the latency management of the Quad Cortex after the firmware 2.1 and if and how it has been improved. First of all, if you want more info about latency, you can check out my 23 amp modeling pedalboard latency comparison, where I have also explained the methodology that I have followed to measure it. With this out of the way, let's jump straight to the results, comparing the new latency values with the ones obtained with the old version of the firmware to verify which are the improvements. We have an empty chain, I mean no effect block inserted, that takes around 2 milliseconds. Therefore, we can deduce that the ADA conversion takes around 2 milliseconds. This value has not changed, I mean it is 2 milliseconds now as it was before the firmware upgrade 2.1. Then if you add an amp block and you keep it not activated, the latency does not change, as it does not change even if we add a cab and we switch it off, or if we add both the amp and the cab blocks, keeping both switched off. On the other hand, if we switch on the amp and the cab blocks, the latency reaches 3 milliseconds as before the firmware upgrade. In the tests I did before the release of the firmware 2.1, the latency with the amp and the cab switched off was increasing, with 2.3 milliseconds with the amp switched off and with 2.6 milliseconds with the cab switched off. And if both the amp and the cab were switched off, we reached 3 milliseconds of latency. This is the first significant improvement with the new firmware. I mean, now the latency does not increase if the blocks are in the chain but switched off. The latency increases only when we switch on the blocks. This is a pretty important improvement in my opinion. In fact, now we can build complex signal chains, for instance with just a few effects activated at the time, without impacting the overall latency, where previously my suggestion was to have in the chain only the effects actually used, building different presets when we need to change the active blocks in the chain. Now, if we add a wah, the latency increases a tiny bit. It increases a tiny bit also adding a booster, and when we add the wah, the booster and the tube screamer, we reach around 3.4 milliseconds. Basically, these are the same values I obtained with the previous firmware upgrade. But here I want to point out one pretty important thing. Please check out if you have in the chain the so-called legacy effect blocks. For instance, one of my old signal chain with the new firmware had a tube screamer called Green OD808 Legacy. If I had not changed it to the new Green OD808, the behavior of the block would have been similar to the old firmware. I mean, the latency would have increased even with the effect block switched off. This means that if you want to take advantage of the new firmware, you have to change all the legacy effects to their new version counterpart. Now let's move on adding time effects. If we add a reverb, the latency does not increase. It does not increase even if we add a delay, and it does not increase even if we add both a delay and a reverb. I mean, it stays at 3.4 milliseconds, where previously with the delay and the reverb switched on, we reached 5 milliseconds. This is another pretty significant improvement with the new firmware. I mean, time effects now do not increase latency, or at least the delays and reverbs I have tried. And this is nice. If now we substitute the amp and the cab blocks with the profile of an amp, the values change. With just the profile we have 2.1 milliseconds versus the 2.3 of the old firmware and versus the 3 of the amp and the cab. So here we have a little improvement over the old firmware, and it is confirmed that the profiles are a little bit more efficient in terms of latency compared to the amp and the cab blocks. I have also checked out the effect loop. I mean, if we add an effect loop block for an external effect, just jumping the send and return port with a cable, I mean without any external effect in the loop, we add to the overall latency around 2 milliseconds. So the time basically taken for an ADA conversion. Obviously this value has been obtained without adding any external effect. But if you add an external effect which introduces another ADA conversion, latency sum up. In conclusion, I would say that we have pretty significant improvements here. First of all, now the effect blocks in the chain that are switched off do not increase latency. And here we have to carefully remove the legacy effect we may have in the chain to fully take advantage of this improvement. Second, time effects do not increase latency, and this is a pretty significant improvement. Third, overall the latency of a pretty complex signal chain has improved from around 5 milliseconds to 3.4. This is an improvement of around 32%, which is not bad, and that gets bigger for more complex signal chains. We are still not at the level of the best-in-class unit with around 1 milliseconds of latency like the Boss GT1000 or the new XMG30, but the improvements are, in my opinion, well worth the wait for the new firmware and testify the commitment of Neural DSP in increasing the value of the Quad Cortex. Let me add that I'm pretty proud of our community. In fact, if you check out my previous latency video about the Quad Cortex, my main outcomes and suggestions were exactly the ones that have been fixed with the new firmware. And this means that the voice of our community is listened and taken into consideration, which is very important for me. I would also like to thank Alain, who wrote me an email pointing out that the Quad Cortex latency may have improved with the new firmware. So thank you, Alain, for suggesting the video. That's all for the today video. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know your precious and valuable opinions in the comment section below. And if you're interested in my IRs or in my Tonics or Camper profiles, please check out the link in the card above or description below. See you soon. Bye bye.